Whether you realize it or not, you, me, and honestly everyone we know are currently participating in a massive, high-stakes balancing act every single day. Welcome to the Strategy Show. In this episode, we're looking at how modern businesses are frantically trying to juggle the demand for infinite profit with this really intense, increasing pressure to actually do the right thing. And more importantly, we're going to look at why failing to do the right thing can literally destroy a billion-dollar company overnight. Now, I know a topic like corporate ethics might sound like a dry compliance seminar, but trust me, it isn't. It's the secret engine driving absolutely everything around you. It's the invisible architecture of our modern economy. It dictates the shoes you choose to buy, the way your local supermarket's laid out. It covers how your most personal data is being used by tech giant companies at this very second. And today is really about looking at the mechanics of that corporate morality under a microscope. I'm not here to sit and preach about what companies should do from some moral high ground. Instead, we're going to analyze exactly why organizations make the choices they make, how it directly impacts their bottom line, and how those boardroom decisions ripple out into your daily life. Because nowadays, it's a highly analytical space. Ethics is completely quantifiable. The era of ethics being just a fluffy public relations exercise is entirely over. Now, organizations are treating it as a core operational risk, right alongside fluctuating currency rates or supply chain bottlenecks. Okay, so let's unpack this. Before we throw words around like ethics, we need to look at what that actually means. In corporate risk management space, we're really looking at three distinct levels of behavior when we're looking at ethics. First, we have personal ethical behavior. This is how you or anyone listening conducts themselves at work on a Tuesday. It's the baseline. Not bullying your colleagues, not padding your expense reports, not walking out the door with proprietary trade secrets to give to a rival firm. Then we step up to the second level, which is business ethics, the collective entity. This is how the firm behaves as a whole. Is the executive team quietly offering bribes to foreign officials to win lucrative contracts? Are they aggressively distorting their financial accounts to look more profitable to investors? Are they turning a blind eye to discriminatory hiring practices? Think of it as the culture and the sanctioned actions of the organization. And then you hit the third level, which is ESG, environmental, social, and governance issues. This is the macro level of business ethics. It's the broader recognition that a firm owes a fundamental responsibility to society and its wider stakeholders, rather than just the shareholders who demand those quarterly returns. And a failure at this ESG level is potentially catastrophic. And it looks like a chemical plant polluting a local river, a tech company releasing a fundamentally dangerous product, or a corporation executing poorly handled mass layoffs that devastate a town's economy. And that macro level is where the concept becomes incredibly quantifiable, because it creates this issue called the trust factor. The return on investment for simply being a trustworthy, ethical entity is staggering. Research by the Edelman Trust Barometer suggests around 67% of people will simply stop buying a product if they don't trust the company behind it. Think about that for a second. A brilliant marketing campaign might get you to try a new drink once, but if you fundamentally distrust the company providing it, you will walk away and you will never come back. Trust is the ultimate customer retention metric. And what's crazy is this trust factor is just as critical internally. There's some incredible data from the Harvard Business Review regarding trust in the workplace. The data shows that employees who work at high trust companies report 74% less stress. 74. That is a massive psychological difference. They also probably because of this, have 50% higher productivity and they take 13% fewer sick days. So when we're talking about the mechanics of morality and ethics, we aren't just talking about feeling good. We're talking about tangible, measurable impacts on our organization. So what we're going to try and do today is strip away the moralizing, and we're going to look at ethics purely through the lens of cold, hard business strategy and try and move past it just being, the motivational poster in the coffee area. Now, when people hear ethics in a business context, they often just think of a compliance checklist or a PR exercise. So, to set the stage for our conversation, we have to recognize that today's journey is about moving beyond the baseline of simply doing what is legal. Because the law is really just the floor. Ethics goes far beyond following the law. The real strategic challenge is looking at a company's overarching strategy and asking, is this actually the right thing to do? Because legality and ethics are not always perfectly aligned, and treating them as if they are can be a fatal strategic error. Now let's unpack this, starting with that friction between what is legal and what is ethical. Acting ethically isn't just, following a static rule book. The definition of what society deems acceptable behavior is a constantly moving target. It evolves depending on the time period and the geographical location that you're operating in. It's a highly dynamic process. You can't simply set an ethical policy in the year 2000 and expect it to hold up today. What's considered standing operating procedure in one decade can become a massive liability in the next. We could use smoking adverts from the mid-20th century as a visual example of this. You might be thinking, why are we highlighting something so outdated to talk about modern strategy? Well, because it really strikingly illustrates how dramatically public consensus can shift. In the 1950s, all the way up to kind of the 1980s, 1990s, cigarette advertisements were everywhere. Televisions, family magazines, they were even sponsored by doctors, which is wild to think about now. It was completely acceptable, legally sound business behavior. Now, the product itself didn't change over the next few decades, but society's ethical context shifted profoundly. The tobacco companies didn't change their marketing because they had a sudden moral awakening. No, they changed because society forced them to, and eventually the regulations caught up with that. So we're going to dive into this topic by focusing on those macro strategic ethical issues we talked about before, ESG. Environmental, social, and governance. The big picture about ethics for the company and the lenses that it views its activities to try and decide if it's behaving ethically and strategically correctly. Now, immediately, this brings us to a really rather uncomfortable reality about business strategy. And we shouldn't pull any punches here. The harsh truth is that highly unethical behavior can be incredibly profitable for investors and for managers, at least in the short term. Misusing customer data, overcharging vulnerable people, paying a bribe to secure a monopoly, or dumping waste to avoid disposal fees. All of those things reduce costs or boost revenue instantly. Now, this leads us directly to a very famous and heavily debated corporate social responsibility philosophy, which is the Milton Friedman viewpoint. Friedman stated that the business of business is business. Now, that might sound a bit odd, but there's actually a simple concept here. The underlying idea is that an organization's only real obligation, its primary moral duty, is to make money for its shareholders, while meeting only the absolute bare minimum legal regulations required to operate. And we're going to try and talk about this viewpoint impartially, because understanding this perspective is vital to understanding the historical context of corporate strategy. For decades, this was the dominant lens through which business success was viewed. And here's where it gets really interesting, because you can actually see that Friedman philosophy playing out today, heavily supported by our own behavior as consumers. Let's look at the fast fashion industry. Customers today are more connected and informed than ever before. Most people know that the labour practices in fast fashion supply chains are ethically, at best, highly questionable. And they know the environmental impact of disposable clothing is disastrous. But we accept it because we want a cheap, trendy outfit for the weekend. And because the customers keep buying, the shareholders keep making money. So, does a lack of ethics actually harm the company at all if the customers themselves don't seem to care? It's a very cynical view, but I guess a very real strategic question that boardrooms grapple with constantly. The academic rebuttal to that is that ignoring ethics tends to inevitably alienate other key stakeholders eventually. But I mean, does it really matter? Fast fashion giants are making billions. When does that other shoe actually drop? It feels like some companies just get away with being unethical indefinitely. Well, the shoe drops in areas the consumer might not immediately see, or it drops suddenly in the form of a crisis. You might, for example, keep the bargain hunting customer, but you might lose your ability to attract top talent who refuse to work for an unethical brand. Or you might face sudden devastating regulatory crackdowns that wipe out your profit margins overnight. A single major scandal can destroy decades of brand equity in an afternoon. So there is a very real risk to acting unethically in the medium to long term, even if there doesn't appear to be a short-term issue for the organisation. Now, this introduces the strategic concept of enlightened self-interest. This is the idea that by trying to go beyond the bare minimum of the law and proactively considering the needs of wider stakeholders, the company is ultimately ensuring its own long-term benefit and survival. It's risk mitigation on a macro scale. So how does a company actually prove that? Because long-term survival sounds great in a boardroom, but how does it translate into making a product? Well, going back to what we talked about before, we have these three overlapping lenses that organizations use to ensure that their strategies are actually ethical. These are business ethics, sustainability, and ESG, or corporate social responsibility. Now, we could do entire podcast series on these topics. So what I want to really home in on is the second lens. We're going to focus in on the idea of sustainability, because for many organizations, that is a particularly hot topic of the three. The word sustainability gets thrown around a lot, usually just meaning being green or, planting a few trees for a marketing campaign. Something that's often called greenwashing, doing one nice thing for the environment to distract from all the damage the rest of your organization's doing. But sustainability is really about taking a very long-term view of business success across three distinct pillars: social, environmental, and economic. And I want to dig into those because the logic here hopefully strips away the fluff. Starting with the social pillar. This focuses on human rights, equal opportunities, and the actual societal impact of the products that you are making. Are your products harmful? Are they addictive? Are they eroding the community? The underlying logic of the social pillar is sheer self-preservation. The argument is if an organization's products are widely seen as being problematic or being deeply harmful to society, or if, let's go really dramatic, society itself begins to collapse due to inequality and unrest, that poses an existential risk to the success of the company. A business can't thrive in a failing society. There's no stable market for your goods if the social fabric is unraveled. And even if people don't collectively rise up against us as a business, if we're seen as being harmful to society, eventually legislation will be created to stop us, or customers will leave us en masse. Either way, as an organisation, we're finished. Then there's our second pillar, environmental. This is the impact on the planet: pollution, waste, depletion of natural resources. And again, we can bring this right back to cold, hard strategy. It's not just about saving the whales. It's about protecting your own supply chain. If a company fails to protect natural resources, they are actively destroying the raw materials they need to manufacture their products in the future. You can't build a product if the resources don't exist anymore. So if we waste rare earth materials or fossil fuels which only exist in finite amounts, or if our business contributes towards the collapse of ecosystems that we rely on to generate our products, again, we're potentially finished as an organization, and there are no more shareholder returns that we can offer then. The third pillar is economic. This isn't just about the company's profit margin, it's about the firm's impact on the wider economy, job provision, economic development, fair wealth distribution. If a massive corporation suppresses wages to the point where its workers live in poverty, it's fundamentally failing to distribute wealth. And the strategic consequence of that can be profound. I mean, a failure here reduces the overall customer base across the entire economy. If people don't have money, they can't buy your products. And if that's replicated by other companies in the economy, it will severely limit the market for your products. If we connect this to the bigger picture, what these three pillars of sustainability really prove is that ethics isn't just some luxury add-on or a charitable afterthought. It is deeply, inextricably intertwined with basic business survival. If you destroy your society, your environment, and your economy in the pursuit of short-term profit, you eventually destroy your own business and wipe out all shareholder value. It's a closed loop. It moves ethics from the realm of abstract philosophy into the realm of hard-nosed risk management and long-term strategic planning. A strategy that ignores those pillars is fundamentally fragile. Now, this brings us to an example of a company that built its entire strategic existence around this concept of enlightened self-interest. It's The Body Shop. This was a chain that was set up by Anita Roddick in 1976, starting as a single little shop in Brighton, England, selling ethical cosmetics and skincare. The strategic choices made by The Body Shop from day one were radically different for the 1970s and arguably very ahead of their time. They built their entire supply chain and brand identity around ethics. They insisted on all natural ingredients. They actively sourced those ingredients from ethical producers, ensuring that fair prices were paid. And they took a loud, absolute stance against animal testing, which was standard practice for major cosmetic brands at the time. They introduced refillable containers to reduce waste long before that was fashionable. And they stated that they actively funneled a portion of their profits into the Body Shop Foundation to support environmental and human rights campaigns. Now, this company wasn't just trying to run a charity. This was a brilliant, highly effective strategic differentiator. By explicitly including the interests of wider stakeholders, animals, farmers, the environment into its core mission, the Body Shop stood out in a crowded, highly synthetic cosmetics market. And because of that, they attracted a fiercely loyal customer base who specifically wanted their purchasing power to align with their values. It was enlightened self-interest executed perfectly. It was voluntary differentiation that paid off handsomely. However, it's worth noting there is a very important shift happening right now. While companies like The Body Shop did this voluntarily decades ago, regulations are now aggressively catching up. In the UK, for example, the Companies Act of 2006, along with UK GAAP reporting regulations, now legally require companies to disclose strategic issues relating to their environmental and social impacts. Now, GAAP, for anyone outside of finance, stands for Generally Accepted Accounting Practice. These are the strict kind of ironclad rules that dictate how a company's financial profits are documented and reported. So these same rigid rules are now starting to apply to how organizations report their social and environmental footprint. That's the trajectory we're on. It means that considering our wider societal impact isn't just a nice way to differentiate our brand if we choose to anymore, it's becoming mandatory. It's rapidly moving from voluntary best practice to a strict, legally enforced baseline. You have to be able to account for your strategic footprint with the same rigor that you apply to your balance sheet. Adding to the complexity is the fact that ethics is actually only part of the strategic picture. That the Body Shop started a long fall from grace with its customers right back in the 1990s, when it emerged that many of its actions around the use of non-synthetic ingredients and its donations to charity didn't match the claims made by their marketing campaigns. On top of this, other companies like Lush in the UK saw the value in the ethical market for cosmetics and took market share from the Body Shop. And finally, that the higher prices that the Body Shop had to charge for supplying more ethical products became less acceptable to customers as ongoing cost of living crises squeezed household budgets. This eventually led the Body Shop, once this kind of massive ethical behemoth of a business, to the brink of bankruptcy on more than one occasion, and has fundamentally destroyed most of its market share. So what does all this mean for professionals actually working in these businesses today? Because it's one thing to talk about Anita Roddick pioneering this in the 70s, but it's another to sit in a boardroom today facing modern technology and globalized markets. Well, there are some specific modern ethical battlegrounds where these strategic choices are playing out right now. And these are tough dilemmas, and we're going to have a chat through a few of them. First up, we have data and privacy. This is a huge one. Organizations today have got an unprecedented ability to collect and utilize data. They track customer spending habits, which allows them to discriminate between customers strategically based on their perceived lifetime value. Who gets the best customer service? The highest spender. But the internal monitoring of employees is even more intense. Employees are regularly monitored via their keystrokes, their emails, the GPS location of their company phones, and increasingly through wearable technology provided by the employer, which, I'll be honest, blows my mind completely. It's intense. It's one thing to check if I'm logging into my computer late. It's another to track my physical movements or monitor my biorhythms while I'm stressing over a quarterly report. I mean, where does the company's right to manage its resources end and my personal privacy begin? You can easily see the cold strategic argument for it. It optimizes efficiency, it prevents time theft, it maximizes output. But balancing those pure efficiency gains against fundamental human privacy and dignity is a massive ethical tightrope. Now, what's fascinating here is that the efficiency gains are easily quantifiable on a spreadsheet, but the erosion of trust and morale is invisible until it causes a structural collapse in the workforce. A similar power dynamic plays out in the second big modern ethical issue that's playing out in the real world, which is supply chain power. If we use the example of large retail food stores, let's say, the massive supermarket chains in North America and Europe, they control access to the consumer and therefore dictate terms. They can and do demand extremely poor prices and very long credit periods from relatively weak suppliers. I mean, think about the farmers at the bottom of that chain. The strategic result for the supermarkets is lower costs and higher margins, which the stock market rewards them for. But the ethical reality is the direct impoverishment of many farmers, both domestically and especially in developing nations. They're squeezed beyond the breaking point to try and subsidize those cheap supermarket prices. It's an invisible cost that we as consumers don't really see when we're just casually tossing a bag of food into our shopping trolley. The consolidation of power in the supply chain creates a scenario where the most profitable action is often the most exploitative. But perhaps the most uncomfortable ethical area that we need to consider deals with the pricing of scarce resources. This is an increasingly newsworthy topic that you will see if you keep up with the business news, because it's where the conflict between profit and human life becomes undeniable. We're talking about the profound ethical implications of having pricing power over essential life-saving goods. For example, the pricing of vital life-saving drugs and the monopolization of pricing of purified water in developing nations. It's a heavy one because, if you hold the patent to a life-saving drug, basic economic strategy, the Milton Friedman approach we talked about earlier, tells you to price it to maximize your financial return for shareholders. I mean, you've spent billions on research and development. The strategy says you recoup that as aggressively as possible. But if that price mathematically excludes poorer individuals or entire nations, resulting in a widespread preventable death, then surely you've crossed a severe ethical threshold, because you're using your strategic monopoly to leverage human suffering for profit. This raises an important question, and I want you, the listener, to really put yourself in this scenario. Imagine that you're an accountant or a strategic manager sitting in that pharmaceutical boardroom. You have a fiduciary duty to your shareholders to return a profit on the billions that you've spent on R&D. But you're also looking at a spreadsheet where your profitable pricing strategy directly correlates to a restriction of life-saving drugs for people who desperately need them. How do you weigh that? How do you apply enlightened self-interest when the short-term cost is literally human lives? It's the ultimate test of professional judgment. And that brings us perfectly to what I hope is the core takeaway from our session today. Navigating these issues isn't just about memorizing textbook definitions of CSR or being able to recite the 3 pillars of ESG. It's about application in the face of immense pressure. In our session today, we started by looking at how the very definition of acceptable ethical behavior constantly shifts beneath our feet. We explored how the long-term survival of a business is completely dependent on sustainability, not just saving the environment, but preserving the society and economy that the business relies on to function. And we've looked at the very real, very messy modern battlegrounds like data privacy, supply chain exploitation, and the pricing of life-saving medicine. The underlying point of all this material is to develop a specific type of critical thinking. The goal is to cultivate the professional judgment required to look at any company's strategy, strip away the marketing spin, and ask what is probably the hardest question in business. Is this actually the right thing to do? Because doing the legal thing or the immediately profitable thing is no longer enough to guarantee long-term success. The risks of ignoring the wider impact of what we do is simply too high. This is all about building a business that actually deserves to exist in the future. It's a heavy topic, but an incredibly vital one for anyone stepping into a leadership role. Before I let you go, I want to leave you with one final slightly provocative thought to mull over on your own. Everything that we've discussed today relies on human judgment. A human manager weighing the weight of a decision, feeling the friction between profit and ethics. But as AI and complex algorithms begin to make more and more autonomous strategic decisions for companies, from setting dynamic pricing models for scarce resources to automatically optimizing global supply chains for the absolute lowest cost, how do we code enlightened self-interest into a machine? It's a terrifying thought. When a computer simply decides the most mathematically profitable path involves exploiting a supplier or invading a customer's privacy, who ultimately becomes responsible for the ethics of that strategy? Something to think about. Thanks to everyone listening for joining us on this episode. I hope you found it useful and hopefully interesting. If you have been listening, remember to follow us so you get notified of future episodes as they drop. We'll see you next time.